Hi, my name is Amrita and this is my booktube. Today I'm going to do the time and place book tag because you know I love book tags, and I think it was Rosie who said that basically my channel is already an extended version of this tag because I'm constantly talking about books that meant a great deal to me at a certain point in my life, and I would just like to talk about it. Also, I'm recording this on a Sunday, so if you hear children shrieking in the background, it's because they're having like this very exciting basketball game in the background. I suppose I should just go out there and tell them to stop, but it turns out when you live in a society, kids also have the right to exist. I've seen various people do various numbers of books, and I think the original tag is about 10 books, but I don't know if I'm going to do the full 10 because this really kind of stressed me out a little bit, because it's very different when you are talking about books and you are placing them in a context for yourself versus you going out deliberately and then trying to think about the books that meant things to you at specific points in your life, because some of those books really got me over some really hard times and I didn't particularly want to talk about them. So I have a list and it's going to be somewhere between like 5 to 8 books. We'll see what I want to talk about as we make this video. First up, we have a physical book, which is a rarity on this channel, but here is it's called the Ukrainian Folktales, and you can see it's a little bit beaten up. It's kind of made its way over, God, I don't know how many moves, like I've had this for such a long time. I got it when I was about 10, like 9 or 10 years old, and it's exactly what it says. It's folktales from the Ukraine. So the story behind this is not to go into a deep history lesson, but basically once a year in Delhi, we used to have this book fair. And it was truly exciting for everybody because it meant that we had access to basically publishing from all around the world. And this was a time when we also had really close links to Soviet Russia. And so there used to be this giant bookstall from the Soviet Union at the book fair. And it sounds sort of quaint now to talk about like a book fair and like how crowded it was, but there's a place in Delhi and it's called the Pragati Maidan, and it's huge and it's an exhibition ground. And there's this really interesting architecture. It's very modernist in feel, and you had to literally fight to get inside this giant space. It felt like all of Delhi, like all of India came to that book fair. And the Soviet Union stall was always really thronged because, I don't know, it just felt very exotic, yet very familiar. And we've had very strong cultural links with the Soviet Union, so I guess it just made sense. And my dad used to get us special passes to go in because it didn't really help us get in, because once you were inside the exhibition hall, it was basically every man for himself. But the special passes would let you get off your car at like a closer point, so you didn't have to walk half a mile to get in from the parking lot. That's how busy and crowded that exhibition hall was. And on one of these trips, I wanted a book and I thought that this looked really pretty, and my dad got it for me and I loved it so much. Western fairy tales tend to be very Disneyfied, for lack of a better term. So you take these really grim stories in which really terrible things happen to people, They were meant to be cautionary tales of morality, and then you sort of make it all rainbows and roses. And because the Russians didn't have a Walt Disney to tidy everything up and make it all, bright and cheerful and really safe for kiddie consumption, what you got were stories that were just as menacing and cautionary as they were intended to be. I can totally see how little children might have been absolutely terrified, but I was a fairly weird kid. Not that you can tell by watching my videos. And I thought they were amazing, you know. These were fairy tales with real stakes to them. I love them. They're so integral to my understanding of fairy tales and the power that they can hold and what they can do for you and your imagination. I have no idea where you can find a copy of it, but I love it, I have it, and I still reread it from time to time. Next up is To Serve with Love, which is, again, like I've spoken about this before, when I was a little girl and for summer vacations, we always somehow ended up back in my grandmother's home in my mother's hometown. And in my grandma's home, everybody had a siesta in the afternoon. So in the afternoons after lunch, for about 2.5, 3 hours, I was absolutely free to do whatever I wanted. And I would just read. And it wasn't a particularly reading house, but one of my uncles had left behind this sort of mini library of Reader's Digest condensed books, which is a compilation of the year's bestsellers, basically, from, like, you know, I think it started sometime in the 1930s or something, and then it continued until the 1990s when it was rebranded as something else. But these are collections, the ones that we had in our home were collections from the 1950s and 60s, which is where my love for the mid-20th century fiction as a genre began. I don't think it's an actual genre, but it is one to me. And To Serve with Love was actually remade into a movie, or made into a movie, with Sidney Poitier, and my mother loved it. And she would talk about it all the time and what a wonderful story it was and how much she loved it as a film. And that's actually how I began reading these books, because one day I was just, so bored. I really feel bad for kids today who don't understand the value of boredom, because it really drives you to do so many different things. But one day I was really bored and I just went through the books, which I think, like, nobody told me I couldn't, but I was definitely way too young to be reading the books in that shelf, but there wasn't anybody around. So I picked up, one of the books at random, and it had To Serve with Love as one of the choices. And I remembered what my mother had said, so I sat down and I started reading it, and I thought it was amazing. It's basically the story of a young black man who moves to a high school, and it's a pretty rough high school and it's a rough neighborhood, and the kids have real problems, and he realizes that nobody actually treats them with respect and dignity. And the book is about him beginning to teach his students the value of things like that, and by leading by example, he ends up absolutely changing their lives, because they go from being problem kids to being young men and women. When I think back upon it, I think it's a very 1950s cultural idea of like what the poor people need, because it's a very simple message, about treating people the way you would like to be treated. I mean, that's something that translates to pretty much any era and any culture. And it's sort of wrapped up in this world of like kids from a rough background. I haven't reread this in donkey's years, so I don't know how well it holds up. But I do suggest that you try and watch the movie, if not the book. For me, when I think about it, I am immediately transported to these lazy monsoon afternoons in my grandmother's drawing room, and I would just sort of snuggle down in her chair. She had this big leather armchair that she used to like to sit in, and there would be an ottoman, and I would use it as a footstool, and I would have snacks, and I would be absolutely alone, and nobody would bother me, and I could just imagine. There are entire worlds that I have traveled to in that drawing room. Next up are the Biggles books. Now these are actually, I don't know if it's just a British Commonwealth thing. But so Biggles is this young man. He's actually way too young to enlist, but when the First World War breaks out, he enlists in the British Army and becomes part of the nascent RAF. So the writer was actually one of those first aviators who fought for Britain in the First World War and was actually taken prisoner of war during that action. He wrote these books that in the beginning, I think they were a lot more realistic and they were pretty grim because, you know, they were talking about war. And those first years were full of pilots basically dying on their first flight, because pretty much all the modern inventions that we have today, whether it's oxygen or parachutes or ejector seats, none of those things existed back then. So you were really just hopping into this machine that had been invented just a few years ago and then taking to the skies and hoping for the best. Those are some real stakes. And then eventually what happened was that it really started to appeal to a younger audience who were enthralled by this idea of aeroplanes, you know, just kids love aeroplanes. We had the complete set in our school library. Now, in the 70s and maybe the 80s, Biggles actually went through this sort of process that I think Enid Blyton also went through in Britain, where they sort of pointed out that these are pretty racially sensitive, by which they mean, you know, racist. But things like that didn't really make its way to India, like I've said before. So when I was growing up in the, you know, the 80s and 90s, whatever, we still had the Biggles books. I don't know if they still have them in school libraries in India, but we definitely did when I was growing up. And I wasn't that big a fan, but I do have this very strong memory of the senior library. So we had access to the senior library when we were in 6th grade. And I have this really strong memory of it being winter. It was January, and winter in Delhi is the worst, like the literal worst. And I remember being so cold because we had marble floors and really high ceilings. So it was really drafty, and we also had like French windows for some reason. My school really went in for fancy architecture. And I remember just being so cold, I was shivering. Like I had my tights on, I had my woolens on and my woolen skirt, my sweater, I had like a coat on, and I was still so cold because I'm such a tropical flower, you guys. And I remember just clutching this book to my chest and sort of shivering my way over to the librarian to get it. I'm not saying that I disliked the Biggles series because I was that cold and I sort of associated with being cold, but I just don't really care for the series that much. Actually, I think I would like to go back and reread the first few books because I think they're more historical fiction and I think they might be more interesting. But the later ones, you know, he was really writing for his audience, and his audience was like way younger, and so I think they became like adventure stories for young men or something. So yeah, I think maybe I should reevaluate those. Jumping forward in time, the next book that I want to talk about is My Invented Country by Isabel Allende. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, but I love this book so much. I started reading this book when I was in school in New York City, and I literally went everywhere holding my copy of this book. I would absolutely sit people down and read aloud passages from it. That's how much I loved it. Allende is actually one of the most amazing lyrical writers that I've come across, and if you haven't checked out any of her books, then I strongly recommend them. But My Invented Country is her memoir as a writer and as a person, and it's a very specific kind of book. I don't know if I would recommend this to everybody. I think I would because it's just written so beautifully that if you enjoy a memoir, then I think you would enjoy this book. But for me, I was in writing school at the time, and it was the first time that I had read the words of a person who was describing the writing life, their imagination and the experiences that propelled their writing. And I just connected so strongly with her story and her voice. It was amazing. I have these very strong images in my head of just walking down the street from Washington Square Park. My apartment was in Union Square Park, and I just have this really strong visual of it being fall and me just like walking down the road, just alone in a crowd of people, with her words just buzzing around my head and just her voice just filling me up. It was such a profound experience for me, and I love it. And I haven't actually reread it in years and years and years, mainly because I'm afraid that I'll reread it and then I won't connect to it, or I won't feel about it the way that I felt back then. When you love something and it's so perfect in that particular time and place, and then you're just afraid to bring it forward into the present, it's almost like you might defile it. That's where I'm at. The last one that I want to talk about is called The Time of the Dark by Barbara Hambly. If I'm remembering it correctly, and I think I am, this was the first fantasy book that I read. My best friend Simran, whom I haven't spoken to in like years and years and years, but we used to be very close, and we were in grade school. I think I was in like 6th grade or something, and she gave me this book. She was like, well, maybe you'd like it, I don't know. And I immediately fell in love with it. It's very classic fantasy, it's about this mysterious race of monsters who have re-emerged, and now mankind needs to fight them. And nobody really knows how to fight them, or even what they are, or how to even counter them. But mankind is in peril and they don't know what to do. And it's a trilogy and it's a classic, and I was obsessed. Simran, I think, also did this thing where, she had the first 2 books in the series and she didn't have the last one, and I nearly went out of my mind before I could find the last one in the trilogy and read it. I don't think she really cared for it, but I remember just being obsessed with it. And I was immediately hooked, and I wanted more stuff like it. And so when I think about it, I remember Simran and Shweta and Aditi, and we used to fight and we used to hang out and we used to talk all this rubbish, and it was just this very sweet middle school friendship. And it also gave me my love of fantasy. If you haven't read Time of the Dark and you are a fan of fantasy, I think the trilogy is actually called the Darwath. I think that's how you say it. But if you haven't read it, then I do actually recommend reading it. Like, I think it's one of the classics, a forgotten classic maybe, because I've literally never come across another person who's read it. But I think it's pretty great. So this was my time and place tag. Yeah, if you enjoyed this video and you like the idea of this tag, then I highly recommend doing it. I think it's really fun. Like, I've really enjoyed watching everybody's version of this one, just because it gives you such an insight into how we all grew up and what's important to us. And it's just a fun little insight into everybody. And I really enjoy them, and I would love to see more of them. So consider yourself tagged on YouTube, off YouTube, on Bookstagram, wherever you want to do it. And let me know, because I would like to check it out. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.